Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Sterling called her to the residents during morning rounds, the words landing like a dismissal disguised as observation. Danielle Ross didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She was 3 steps away, checking the cardiac monitor on a post-op patient, her hand steady as they moved across the equipment with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her scrubs. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, that constant electric drone that never stopped, never let you forget you were inside a building designed to keep people alive or at least try. She wore her composure like armor. Long sleeves in a Georgia summer, the kind of choice that made the newer nurses ask questions she never answered, the linen covering surgical scars that had their own stories, stories the Coast Guard had ordered her to keep buried along with her records 3 years ago after Baghdad fell apart in ways nobody was supposed to talk about. Danielle had learned to move through Oak Creek Memorial like a ghost, the kind of nurse who took the stairs instead of elevators, who volunteered for the night shifts when the hospital went quiet and the critical patients were the only ones still watching, who checked potassium levels at 3 in the morning when everyone else was sleeping. Her limp was barely noticeable by hour 2 of her shift, the morning stiffness wearing away as her body remembered that pain was information, that discomfort was something you worked through, not something you mentioned. The faded unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining, positioned directly against her heart, and she pressed her hand against it sometimes, not often, not where anyone could see, just enough to remember that the person she used to be still existed under the careful invisibility she'd constructed. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 6:22 a.m., the kind of precise timing that came from years of knowing exactly how to make an entrance. He moved through the cardiac ward of Oak Creek Memorial like he owned the tile beneath his feet, his white coat starched to crisp perfection, his salt and pepper hair styled in that carefully expensive way that told everyone he came from money and had never stopped knowing it. His entourage of residents trailed behind him, 5 of them, all younger, all watching his face for cues about which patients mattered and which ones were just bed occupancy. His voice had that particular timbre, the kind that made people lean in not because he was quiet but because he demanded to be heard, demanded to be the last word on every clinical decision that moved through these hallways. He didn't glance at the nurses' station as he passed. People like Dr. Sterling didn't see the nursing staff unless they were in the way or the staffing numbers weren't where he wanted them. Danielle was restocking the medication cart near the entrance to the cardiac intensive care unit, her movements efficient and quiet, the way someone moves when they've learned to take up as little space as possible. She watched him without appearing to watch, the way soldiers learn to maintain situational awareness without making it obvious. 3 residents followed Sterling to room 412, where the septic patient had been stable since the previous evening, or seemed stable, the way patients sometimes do right before they crash. The chart was still warm in her hands when she pulled it, the vital signs printed out in that precise hospital formatting that was supposed to tell the whole story in numbers and abbreviations. Temperature 101.4. Blood pressure climbing, 148/89 at midnight, 156/92 at 4 in the morning. But it was the potassium that made her jaw tighten. 6.8 millimoles per liter. Critically high. The normal range was 3.5 to 5.0. She had the number memorized the way you memorize things that can kill you if you forget them. The discharge order was already written in Sterling's loop script across the chart, efficient, confident, the handwriting of someone who didn't doubt his own decisions. 24-hour observation complete, vital stable, begin discharge protocol. She read it twice to be absolutely certain, the way you check a weapon twice before handing it to someone. The patient's potassium was climbing, not stable. The antibiotic protocol should have brought the fever down more than it had. And the way his blood pressure was trending, there was something under the surface that the lab work was starting to whisper about, something that needed attention, not a discharge ticket. She took one measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath that came from training, from knowing that what you did in the next 30 seconds could change the trajectory of someone's life. She walked to the resident station where Dr. Sterling was reviewing the chart with his attendants, her footsteps barely audible on the hospital floor because she'd learned years ago how to move without announcing herself. The other nurses didn't look up. They were accustomed to Danielle's quiet shifts, her extra hours, her willingness to take the cases nobody else wanted. She was the kind of nurse who didn't cause drama, didn't demand attention, didn't complain when assignments went sideways. The hallway was filling with the ambient noise of morning shift change, phones ringing, ventilators cycling, the metallic sound of equipment carts being wheeled to different rooms, but the space around Dr. Sterling seemed to compress that noise somehow, the way his presence made air pressure change, like standing downwind from a man-o'-war. "Dr. Sterling," she said, her voice level, her eyes on the chart. "The patient's potassium is critically high, a 6.8 last draw at 4 in the morning." She paused for exactly 1 second, the kind of timing that lets information land before you add more. The discharge order could cause cardiac complications. The hallway went dead silent. Not the absence of sound, but the particular kind of silence that happens when something has shifted, when the air molecules have rearranged themselves around an interruption of the natural order. Dr. Sterling turned slowly, the kind of movement that suggested he was converting surprise into calculation in real time, reorganizing his thoughts into something weaponized. His residents stopped moving. One of them, a third-year named Kovac, actually stepped backward, creating distance like he sensed what was coming. The smile that crossed Dr. Sterling's face was not a smile that reached his eyes. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed an opportunity he'd been waiting for. "That would be a fascinating clinical observation," he said, his voice carrying a particular texture, something smooth on the surface with an edge underneath, like a knife wrapped in silk. "If it were accurate." He turned to address the residents, turning his back to Danielle with the deliberation of someone making a statement. The potassium was trending downward on the last 3 draws. "The discharge is clinically appropriate." The lie was delivered with such confidence that 2 of the residents actually nodded, accepting the information like it had weight. It didn't have weight. It had the opposite. It was the kind of lie that was lighter than air, designed to float upward and lodge itself in the minds of people who were trained to trust authority more than they trusted data. Danielle's left hand was still holding the chart. Her right hand was at her side, perfectly still. She could feel her pulse in her wrists, that particular elevated rhythm that came from adrenaline, from recognizing threat, from the part of her brain that had learned in Baghdad what it felt like to be right about something and have no authority to do anything about it. "The draw at 4 a.m. showed 6.8, she said, her voice carrying no inflection, no accusation, just information. "It's in the system." Sterling turned back to her now, and his expression had shifted into something more calculated, more dangerous in its deliberation. He was no longer smiling. He was assessing her the way a hunter assesses prey that has just shown itself to be aware, to be capable of causing problems. "Are you," he said slowly, "questioning my clinical judgment in front of my residents?" The question itself was a loaded weapon. It wasn't a request for information. It was a declaration of boundaries, a statement that questioning him was itself a violation, that the act of disagreement was the crime regardless of whether the clinical concern was valid. The resident shifted, uncomfortable now, sensing the shift in power dynamics, understanding that something had been established in that moment, that challenging Sterling came with cost. Danielle could have stopped. She could have nodded, accepted the correction, stepped back into the invisibility that had kept her safe for 3 years. That's what the Coast Guard wanted. That's what the buried records were supposed to protect, a woman who could disappear, who could blend into the background, who could help people quietly without ever drawing attention. But the patient in 412 had a potassium level that was climbing. And she had hands that knew how to read a rhythm strip, how to recognize the electrical chaos that hyperkalemia could trigger in a cardiac system. She had a body that remembered Baghdad, that remembered the difference between standing silent and standing responsible. "The last 3 draws," she said, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, "show potassium climbing. 6.1 at midnight. 6.4 at 2 a.m. 6.8 at 4 a.m. She said each number like it was its own sentence, like each number was a fact too heavy to combine with the others, requiring separate weight. "The trend is up, not down." She watched his face recalibrate, watched the moment his calculation shifted from troublesome nurse to nurse who has information he cannot suppress, and then watched as he made the decision that would begin everything that came after. Dr. Sterling's voice carried across the nurse's station during shift change, loud enough for everyone to hear. Nurse Ross seems to think her 2-year degree qualifies her to override my medical decisions. Perhaps we should get her a white coat and let her do rounds." Laughter rippled through the residence like a current through water. He wrote her up on the unit board in red marker, insubordination, D. Ross, where every staff member would see it during their shifts. The nickname started that afternoon. Dr. Ross delivered with dripping sarcasm whenever she entered a room. The first real test of her composure came 3 days later in Commander Mitchell's room. His wife and adult daughter were present as Sterling reviewed discharge medications. Danielle had caught something during her morning assessment. The prescribed beta blocker would clash dangerously with the commander's existing heart medication, a combination that could trigger severe bradycardia, dropping his heart rate into the 30s. She'd spent the morning checking the medication interaction database 3 times to be absolutely certain. When Sterling entered the room, she approached quietly, placing the chart across her palm where he couldn't ignore it. "Dr. Sterling, the propranolol combined with his current verapamil regimen could cause severe bradycardia." Sterling's face reddened. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Then, Mrs. Ross is playing doctor again. "Commander, I apologize that my nursing staff doesn't understand that I went to medical school for 8 years while she took a correspondence course. Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable if I assigned someone who knows her place." He turned to the wife. "Some nurses develop delusions about their competence. It's actually quite common." The commander's wife looked away, embarrassed for everyone. His daughter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with the same bearing as her father, watched Danielle carefully, studying her face as if trying to read something beneath the surface. Danielle's hands remained steady. Her jaw clenched once, a small muscle movement along her temples, and then she reset it. She said nothing. She turned and left the room without meeting Sterling's gaze. That was the hardest part, the not responding, the not defending herself with the knowledge that she was right and he knew it too. The break room exile started the next day. Danielle sat down with her lunch at the corner table, a container of rice and vegetables she'd prepared at 5 in the morning, and 3 nurses immediately stood and left, their chairs scraping loud across linoleum like a coordinated assault. By day 4, the room cleared within seconds of her arrival. Sometimes they didn't even wait until she sat down. Patricia, the older surgical nurse who'd transferred from the VA 6 months prior, watched this happen and said nothing, which was a kind of solidarity that made Danielle's chest tight. She ate alone at the corner table where the fluorescent light had a flicker in it, a persistent electrical stutter that matched the rhythm of her breathing. On day 6, she allowed herself one tear. Just one. It tracked down her cheek while she stared at the cold rice in her container, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the empty room, as if daring it to judge her. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She understood the difference because she'd learned it in Baghdad, learned that the body's impulse to break could be controlled, compartmentalized, weaponized in reverse. She pressed her hand against the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed it against her ribs where her heart was doing its job despite everything, and she took the next breath. The second public humiliation came during a family consultation in the cardiac care unit. Sterling stood at the bedside of an elderly patient named George Kaufman, who was recovering from an anterior wall MI. His son and daughter-in-law were listening intently as Sterling explained the medication plan. Danielle had administered for morphine and nitroglycerine at 0140 hours, per Sterling's orders, after carefully checking the patient's respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, and blood pressure. The patient's breathing had remained strong. The saturation held at 98%. Everything was textbook correct. Sterling glanced at Danielle, and she saw the moment he decided to use her. "I see Nurse Ross administered the pain medication. Did she at least check the patient's respiratory rate first, or was she too busy diagnosing conditions again?" His tone suggested she was the kind of person who confused what she'd seen on television with actual medical knowledge. The son shifted uncomfortably. The daughter-in-law's eyes widened slightly. Danielle's voice came out devastatingly calm, each word measured like medication being drawn into a syringe. Respiratory rate was 16. Blood pressure 118/76. Pulse ox 98%. The medication was given per your order at 1,400 hours. She paused. Let the accuracy sit there. Let everyone hear the precision in her voice, the absolute certainty. It's all documented. Sterling's smile was poisonous. How efficient. Make sure you document that, since apparently you're the only competent person on this floor. He turned back to the Kaufmans as if she'd already ceased to exist. The family looked between Sterling and Danielle, confused about who to believe, which was exactly what he'd intended. An older surgical nurse named Patricia, who'd transferred from the VA in Sioux Falls, watched Danielle check and fall line later that evening, studying the precise, economical movements of her hands. The way she positioned her fingers. The angle of her approach. The practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times, not in a sterile hospital setting but under conditions that required speed and accuracy in the dark. Patricia had worked with combat medics. Patricia recognized the bearing. You don't place lines like someone who learned in nursing school, Patricia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as they stood outside patient room 412. You place them like someone who's done it in the back of a transport under fire. Like someone who knows that a missed line could mean someone dies. She paused. You've got the hands of a medic. Danielle's fingers stilled. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it. She simply said, "Thank you," and continued to the next room, leaving Patricia standing in the hallway with the knowledge that she was right, that something significant was being hidden, and that whatever was happening to this nurse was unjust in a way that went beyond hospital politics. But that wasn't the worst part of what Dr. Sterling was building. He'd started his campaign with methodical precision, the kind of precision that came from years of wielding institutional power and understanding exactly which doors to knock on. On day 7 of the humiliation campaign, he called Dr. Raymond Chen at Savannah Regional Hospital across town. They'd been residents together at Georgetown, back when Sterling still had to prove himself to anyone. "Ray, if Danielle Ross applies there, you should know she has serious judgment issues and refuses to follow protocol. I'm documenting everything before we have to let her go for patient safety reasons." He paused, let that sink in. "Just looking out for you, brother." The State Nursing Board received a formal inquiry 2 days later, carefully worded on Oak Creek Memorial letterhead. "I have concerns about a nurse's credentials and whether her training was properly accredited. Purely due diligence, you understand, but the gaps in her knowledge suggest potential issues with her initial certification." He didn't lie. He didn't need to. Implications were sufficient. Then came Margaret Holloway, the hospital consultant Sterling brought in on Thursday morning with a mandate to evaluate staff performance issues. Sterling fed her a narrative about a problematic employee who undermined physician authority, who'd challenged his medical decisions in front of patients, who was becoming a liability. Margaret was professional and thorough, which meant she was dangerous. She would document everything in language that sounded neutral but carried the weight of institutional authority. Danielle saw the walls closing in because she'd learned to read these patterns. She found herself assigned to solo shifts, her schedule manipulated so she rarely overlapped with Patricia or the few other staff members who trusted her. Her chart notes were scrutinized for any deviation from perfect documentation. A patient's family mentioned, over coffee with Sterling, that he'd privately warned them their nurse had been having performance issues, which made them uncomfortable with her care. Sterling had planted that seed with the precision of someone who understood that doubt was contagious, that once a family started questioning a nurse, that doubt would spread to other families, that patient satisfaction scores would decline, and that those declining scores would become justification for termination. The ticking clock started when Patricia pulled Danielle aside after a shift, her voice low and urgent. "Sterling's building a termination case. I've seen it before. He's getting board members involved, calling other hospitals, making noise with the state board. You've got maybe 2 weeks before they move on it officially. Once Margaret Holloway finishes her report, that's the document they'll use." Patricia's eyes held something fierce. "You need to talk to an employment lawyer. Today." Danielle nodded. She didn't panic. She didn't call anyone. She thanked Patricia quietly and drove to the cemetery instead, to the small grave marker with her husband's name and the dates that represented the entire duration of their marriage, 7 years from wedding day to the IED in Fallujah that took him with 3 other Marines from his convoy. She stood in the rain at his grave, the faded unit patch pressed against her heart beneath her jacket, feeling the embroidered edges with her fingertips. The cemetery was empty except for the sound of rain hammering the ground like applause or condemnation, she wasn't certain which. She whispered to the marble stone, "I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. Tried to just help people quietly. Help them heal without anyone knowing what I was. And I failed at even that. I couldn't save my career any better than I could save you." The rain soaked her scrubs. Water ran down her face and she didn't wipe it away this time. She let it fall. She had no idea that somewhere in the hospital, Commander Robert Mitchell, the Coast Guard officer recovering from valve replacement surgery, the man whose dangerous medication interaction she'd caught, was slowly regaining his strength and his clarity, and that he was beginning to ask questions about the nurse who'd been so soundly humiliated by Dr. Sterling. She didn't know that the commander had called his daughter, Captain Elizabeth Mitchell, a Navy surface warfare officer stationed in Charleston. She didn't know that Elizabeth had said quietly, "I want you to tell me everything you remember about that nurse." Everything. Danielle stood in the rain at a grave and whispered to a dead man, and she didn't know that the next 48 hours would begin to change everything. The monitor alarm split the darkness at 0300 like a scream nobody expected. Commander Mitchell's blood pressure had been holding steady at 118/76 when Danielle checked on him at midnight, a man recovering well, his Navy decoration catching the fluorescent glow above his bed. 3 hours later, his body was betraying him in ways only someone trained to recognize could see coming. Danielle was finishing rounds when she heard it. Not the alarm itself, alarms sounded every few minutes in a hospital, but the particular silence that followed. The silence of a monitor reading something wrong enough that the room held its breath. She moved toward room for 12 without hurrying, without the panic that made nurses run. Running meant you hadn't assessed yet. Running meant you didn't know what you were walking into. The night resident, Dr. Aaron Walsh, stood frozen in the doorway like a deer in headlights. 26 years old, 2nd year through his residency, the kind of doctor who still had hope in his eyes. Commander Mitchell lay back against the pillows, his neck veins distended like they might burst through the skin, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes were half closed, consciousness slipping like a man drowning in a bathtub. Danielle saw 3 things at once: the jugular venous distension, the narrow pulse pressure, the muffled heart sound she could already hear before she even touched her stethoscope to his chest. Pericardial tamponade. Blood or fluid compressing the heart, strangling it, squeezing the chambers until they couldn't fill, couldn't pump, couldn't do the one job they'd been built for. She'd seen it before. Not in a hospital. In a Humvee pulling away from a fire base with shrapnel singing through the air and a Marine screaming because his chest was folding in on itself. "He's in tamponade," Danielle said. Her voice was flat, informational, the way someone orders coffee. Not the voice of a nurse. The voice of someone who'd made this diagnosis in worse light, in worse conditions, with worse tools. "We need to drain the pericardium now or his heart stops in 5 minutes. Dr. Walsh's hand shook as it reached toward his phone. I need to call Dr. Sterling. He's the attending of record. I can't just," the boy's voice cracked on the last word. He was drowning in protocol the way the commander was drowning in his own pericardial sac. Danielle was already moving to the supply cabinet, already pulling the ultrasound machine on its metal cart, already thinking through the needle gauge, 14-gauge angiocath, long enough to reach the pericardium, sharp enough to pierce the membrane in one confident stroke. "He'll be dead in 5 minutes, doctor. Call if you need to, but we do this now." The ultrasound screen flickered to life, and there it was, the commander's heart surrounded by a dark halo of fluid like a planet encased in shadow. The fluid was compressing the right atrium, squeezing the venous return until the pressure equalized and the heart couldn't fill anymore. In another few minutes, the heart would stop trying. It would simply arrest. Dr. Sterling's voice came through Walsh's phone speaker at maximum volume, angry with sleep interruption, harsh with the kind of authority that made residents flinch. What's the situation? Patient Mitchell is showing signs of cardiac tamponade. Nurse Ross is suggesting immediate pericardiocentesis, but I wanted your authorization before proceeding, Anne. Do not let that nurse touch my patient with a needle. Each word came down like a gavel. I'm 40 minutes away. Start him on pressors and wait for my arrival. That's a direct order. The phone went dead. Dr. Walsh looked at Danielle the way someone looks at a cliff edge they're being ordered to walk toward. He said to wait. If I let you do this and something goes wrong, I'll lose my residency. They'll say I let an RN overstep, that I wasn't supervising, that I... Doctor. Danielle's voice dropped an octave. Not loud. Quiet enough that only he could hear it, but with the texture of something immovable. In 4 minutes, this man's heart stops. His daughter wakes up to losing him. You explained to her why you waited for permission while her father died. That's the choice. Captain Jennifer Mitchell woke to the monitor alarms, her hand already moving before her eyes opened, the reflex of someone trained for crisis. She wore a Coast Guard uniform even while sleeping, and she was on her feet in the way that military people stood, ready, aware, assessing. Her father's face had gone grey. Not sick grey. Dying grey. The color of someone whose blood pressure was crashing toward single digits. What's happening? Captain Mitchell's voice carried command the way her father's probably did, the way some people were born speaking authority instead of words. Your father's heart is being compressed by fluid in the sac around it, Danielle said, already swabbing the skin over the xiphoid process with chlorhexidine, feeling the chemical cold spread across the commander's lower chest. He needs a procedure immediately to drain it. The attending physician has ordered us to wait for his arrival. How long until? 2 minutes. Maybe 3 if we're lucky. Captain Mitchell's eyes moved from her father to Danielle to Dr. Walsh. She saw the frozen resident. She saw the nurse who moved like someone performing a procedure she'd done in darkness and blood. She saw what needed to happen, and she'd spent 22 years in the Coast Guard recognizing when someone could be trusted with a life. Are you qualified to do this? Captain Mitchell asked. Yes. 3 words. Not a moment of hesitation. Not a question mark at the end. Then do it. I'm taking responsibility. This is a lawful order from a superior officer. The words unlocked something in Danielle. Not permission, she didn't need permission from anyone to keep someone alive. But acknowledgement. Someone seeing her. Someone knowing that the choice she'd already made was the right one. The needle was smooth in her hand, the kind of smooth that comes from muscle memory forged in conditions where hesitation killed people faster than bullets. She located the subxiphoid space by feel and landmarks, positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle to the skin, aimed it toward the left shoulder. The ultrasound showed her the exact location of the fluid, dark, ominous, lethal. Her hand moved on its own. 18 years of nursing school and regulations and careful protocol fell away, and what remained was the part of her that had stayed alive in Baghdad by being better than the fear. The needle went in. Through the skin. Through the fascia. Through the pericardial membrane with a sensation like pushing through the final layer of resistance. Danielle felt the give, the distinct release that told her the membrane had yielded to the needle's point. The kind of sensation they didn't teach in textbooks. The kind they only taught in the dark, in the field, with shrapnel singing through the air and someone's life balanced on the precision of your hands. I have access to the pericardium, she said. Her voice was steady. The voice of someone who'd done this before, who'd done it when the consequences of failure were the kind that haunted you at 3 in the morning for the rest of your life. Dr. Walsh stood motionless, watching. Watching a nurse perform a procedure that was supposed to be the domain of cardiologists and emergency physicians, watching her move with the terrible, fluid precision of someone for whom this was muscle memory instead of a learned procedure. The kind of precision that made the difference between saving a heart and perforating one. Danielle advanced the catheter over the needle, feeling the slight resistance as it slid through the pericardium into the fluid space. She withdrew the needle, leaving only the thin plastic catheter in place, and connected it to a syringe. The first draw came red. Dark red. Blood that had pooled around the commander's heart while doctors slept and protocols waited to be followed. 60 milliliters. 70. 80. The pressure was releasing, the heart was beginning to fill again, the impossible compression was becoming possible to reverse. An older surgical nurse named Margaret Chen stood in the doorway, watching. She'd been a medic in Ramadi, had worked trauma in the dust and the blood and the worst of it, and she'd retired 5 years ago, swearing she'd never see another pericardiocentesis done outside of an operating room. She watched Danielle's hands move with the kind of precision that made her breath catch. When Danielle spoke, when she calmly said, "Heart rate improving, blood pressure coming up," Margaret leaned toward the nurse beside her and whispered something that would echo through Oak Creek Memorial's night shift for weeks. "You don't learn pericardiocentesis like that from a textbook. Not that kind of access. Not that kind of control. She's done this in the field before. I've seen medics move like that. Only in the field." The commander's monitor began to change. The erratic rhythm smoothed. The oxygen saturation climbed, 68. 72, 79. 86, his blood pressure rose from the critical low, 70/40, the number that meant organ failure was minutes away, to 92/58. Still low, but climbing. Still fighting, but no longer losing. Dr. Walsh finally moved, finally breathed, finally understood what he'd just witnessed. He's stabilizing. "He's alive," Danielle said. She was already disposing of the needle in the sharps container, already documenting the procedure with the calm precision of someone who'd just broken every protocol in Dr. Sterling's playbook and saved a man's life by doing it. She didn't look triumphant. She looked the way soldiers look after surviving something that was supposed to kill them. Like she'd simply done what needed doing. Captain Mitchell stood at her father's bedside, watching his color return, watching the gray recede from his face like a tide going out. She looked at Danielle with the kind of recognition that exists between people who understand what it costs to keep someone alive. But that wasn't the worst part. In 40 minutes, when Dr. Sterling arrived and found his patient stabilized by the very nurse he'd just publicly ordered to stand down, when he discovered that a captain in the United States Coast Guard had countermanded his authority, when he understood that Danielle Ross had just committed the career-ending sin of proving him wrong while saving his patient's life, that's when everything would begin to collapse. By morning, Dr. Sterling moved through the hospital corridors like a man who'd already won. His phone was in his hand before the sun cleared the Georgia pines, 3 board members on speed dial, men who owed him referrals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past decade. The first call lasted 90 seconds. Sterling's voice was calm, conversational, the voice of someone discussing a minor inconvenience rather than orchestrating a woman's professional execution. "I need a favor. There's a nurse at Oak Creek who performed an unauthorized procedure that endangered a patient. I'm moving for termination today." The board member said yes before Sterling finished the sentence. The second call was identical. The third took 2 minutes longer because that board member actually listened, but the answer was the same. By 07:45, Sterling had the institutional weight he needed. By 0800, he'd contacted Margaret Holloway, the hospital consultant who specialized in termination cases, the one who'd already spent 3 weeks building documentation against Danielle. Holloway's folder was thick with incident reports, witness statements, policy violations, most fabricated, all carefully worded to sound legitimate. The state nursing board was next. Sterling's call came in at 0832, flagged as urgent. He spoke to a licensing investigator he'd cultivated for exactly this moment, a man who understood that career advancement came from cooperation. "I'm reporting concerns about the credentials and judgment of a nurse at our facility. She performed an invasive procedure, pericardiocentesis, without physician authorization in direct violation of explicit orders. She's a danger to patients." The investigator said they'd open a file. Sterling knew that was enough. A single complaint to the state board could take months to resolve, and by then, Danielle wouldn't need to worry about her license because she'd already have nothing to lose. The consultant arrived at 0900 sharp, Margaret Holloway with her steel gray suit and clipboard filled with medical legal terminology. She'd never met Danielle Ross, She didn't need to. Holloway's job wasn't truth, it was documentation. She'd learned long ago that in institutional disputes, the person with the thickest file always won. She and Sterling sat in the hospital's risk management office, and Holloway reviewed the case with the efficiency of someone building a case against an enemy combatant. "The unauthorized procedure is your anchor," she said, her voice like a filing cabinet closing. "It violates chain of command. It violates protocol. It shows pattern behavior." She challenged the physician yesterday during rounds. "She's been insubordinate consistently. This one incident proves she's dangerous." Sterling nodded. "She was told explicitly to wait for my arrival. Then we have him countermanding your authority, which is a secondary violation. The captain authorized a procedure she had no business performing." Holloway's pen moved across the legal pad. 3 separate violations. Insubordination. Unauthorized practice. Endangerment. Anyone stands alone. Together, their termination level. "We'll have her out by lunch." The chief of staff was brought in at 0945. Dr. Raymond Chen, a man Sterling had supported through 2 messy divorce proceedings and a gambling problem that required quiet loan arrangements. Chen read the file in silence, his face carefully neutral, but Sterling knew the answer before Chen closed the folder. "We have no choice," Chen said quietly. "The liability exposure is too great. We're terminating her." By 10:30, security had been notified. By 1100, the paperwork was prepared. The conference room where they delivered the termination was deliberately formal. Sterling, Holloway, Chen, a hospital lawyer named Paulson, and Danielle in her still damp scrubs, her hair pulled back, her eyes the color of a winter Atlantic. She sat straight in the metal chair, her hands folded on the table, completely still. Sterling slid the termination letter across the table like a card being dealt. "In a game where the stakes were already settled. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization," he said, each word clipped. "You violated direct orders. You endangered a patient." Danielle read the letter. The words blurred and clarified: gross violation of chain of command. Unauthorized procedures. Immediate termination. Liability exposure. Ineligible for rehire. No severance. The smell of Sterling's cologne filled the room, something expensive and aggressive, the scent of a man who'd never faced actual consequences. "I saved his life," Danielle said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't plead. It was a statement of fact, offered to people incapable of recognizing facts. "You violated protocol because you think you know better than trained physicians," Sterling said. "That's the pattern here. You question authority, you act without permission, you put your judgment above the institutions. This is the final incident, but it's the one that ends this." The lawyer, Paulson, slid a second document across. "This is your final paycheck, minus the security deposit on your locker. These are the terms of your severance. You'll sign that you received notice of your termination and that you understand the reason." Danielle didn't sign immediately. She read every word. She understood that they were giving her nothing, no severance, no reference, no pathway back. They were cutting her off completely, erasing her as if she'd never existed at all. She thought of Marcus, whose own service record had been carefully redacted when he died, whose death certificate listed only that he was a Marine, not which operation he'd been on when the IED took him. She thought of the 17 people she'd extracted from that collapsing safe house while rounds were still coming in, the medic work she'd done on a rooftop in Fallujah with blood on her gloves and mortar fire walking up the street toward her. She picked up the pen and signed. "Security will escort you out," Chen said gently, as if he was doing her a favor. "You'll need to vacate your locker." Security. Not asked to leave. Escorted. Walked out like someone who'd stolen something. The badge deactivation was the first physical blow, the electronic chime as the access card stopped working, as if the building itself had decided she no longer existed. Her locker was on the 3rd floor. She packed slowly. Scrubs, neatly folded. A photograph of Marcus in his marine dress uniform, the one taken 3 weeks before the IED. The jacket with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining against the left side of the chest, positioned over where a heart would beat. 2 security officers stood nearby, not threatening, just present. Witnesses to the removal. The jacket weighed almost nothing in her hands. By 11:45, she was walking out of Oak Creek Memorial through the same ER doors she'd entered 6 months ago. It was raining, a warm Georgia rain that smelled like asphalt and cut grass and the particular dampness that comes from a storm moving inland off the Atlantic. The rain soaked her scrubs. She didn't change. She drove to Beaufort National Cemetery in a daze, the cardboard box on the passenger seat with her entire professional life reduced to loose items. She parked and walked without direction until she found the gravestone with Marcus's name. Michael Marcus Ross. Beloved husband. Marine. She didn't kneel. She stood, the rain pounding her shoulders, the faded unit patch pressed hard against her heart through the jacket lining. The patch was from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Marcus's unit before he was attached to her operation. 3 stitches held it in place, though one was coming loose. She could feel it through the fabric. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered, she whispered to the granite headstone. Tried to just help people quietly. I failed at even that. I couldn't save my career any better than I could save you. Her voice didn't break. It was steady, almost clinical, the voice of someone reporting facts to a superior officer. But her hand shook. As she touched the stone, as if the weight of the day was finally finding its exit point in her fingers. The rain came harder. A thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery, a sound she hadn't heard in 8 years, and her body tensed automatically, muscle memory searching for cover that didn't exist. She pressed the patch tighter against her chest and stood in the rain until the shaking stopped, until her hand steadied, until she was again the woman who appeared on no records and answered to no one. She didn't know that 60 miles away in Savannah, Commander Mitchell was regaining consciousness in his hospital bed, that he was reaching for his phone with his daughter Jennifer holding his hand, that he was asking her to help him find something he couldn't quite articulate, an explanation for why the best nurse he'd ever encountered was no longer working at Oak Creek Memorial. She didn't know that the question forming in his mind would reach a former subordinate now working in the White House, that the inquiry would trigger a series of phone calls that would eventually lead to the unsealing of classified files. She didn't know that her invisible war, the one she'd fought so carefully to keep quiet, the one she'd tried to bury alongside Marcus, was about to become very, very visible. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the beginning. The news cycle exploded within hours. By evening, national networks were running the story in rotation, decorated war hero fired for saving life. The headline scrolled across every screen in the break rooms and waiting areas across Savannah. Sterling's phone rang continuously, reporters, hospital administrators distancing themselves with careful language, the state medical board scheduling an emergency review. Within 48 hours, the hospital board called an emergency session and placed Sterling on administrative leave pending investigation. His wife stopped answering his calls. His daughter, a medical student at Emory, sent a text that made his hand shake. How could you do this to someone? Sterling spent 2 days trying to manage the crisis, calling every favor he'd accumulated over 23 years of climbing the medical hierarchy. But the network that had protected him for so long simply abandoned him. Board members claimed they'd been misled about Danielle's behavior. Colleagues who'd laughed at his condescending remarks about that nurse now released statements saying they'd always had concerns about his judgment. Margaret Holloway, the consultant he'd hired to build the termination case, released a statement through her attorney saying her evaluation had been based on incomplete information provided by Dr. Sterling himself. The walls were closing in, and Sterling was dialing numbers that went unanswered. Then something happened that changed everything. Rashid al-Hamzi, the 47-year-old Iraqi refugee on dialysis in the nephrology ward, saw Danielle's photograph printed on the termination notice taped to the break room bulletin board. He stared at the image for 30 seconds, his hands trembling. The nurse tending to him, a young woman named Patricia Chen, noticed the color draining from his face. "Are you in pain?" she asked. Rashid shook his head slowly, his voice cracking in heavily accented English. That woman. The nurse in the picture. Where is she? Patricia explained that Danielle had been terminated, that there was an investigation, that it was complicated. Rashid gripped her arm with surprising strength. I need to tell you something. I need cameras. I need people to listen. What he said next went viral within 6 hours. In an interview conducted from his hospital bed, Rashid described the night in 2008 when his convoy was ambushed in Jolan district, when his own militia affiliation had marked him as a target even among his own people. The Americans came, he said, his accent thick but his English clear. But they left me there. I was burning. My vehicle was burning. I thought I was dead. He paused, gripping the bed rail. Then she came. A woman in American uniform. She pulled me from the fire. She was treating my burns, talking to me in a calm voice, staying with me while coalition forces arrived. She risked her life for a man who'd been trying to kill her people. Years later, I become sick. I come to America. By chance, I see her photo in that hospital. She was a nurse. She was saving lives in the same way she saved mine. His voice cracked. What kind of doctor fires a person like that? The interview spread across news channels like wildfire. The story was irresistible, a former insurgent, now a refugee, testifying to the character of a woman accused of protocol violations. It forced the conversation back to who Danielle actually was, back to the question of why she'd been really fired. That was when the Coast Guard captain walked into the Oak Creek Memorial boardroom. Commander Mitchell's daughter, Captain Sarah Mitchell, appeared in full dress uniform on a Wednesday afternoon, her presence alone commanding immediate silence. The hospital's legal counsel stood to greet her. She didn't shake his hand. She placed a classified folder on the table and looked directly at the assembled board members. You terminated Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, she said, her voice carrying the weight of military authority. 3-time Navy Commendation Medal recipient. Multiple decorated operations in contested zones. Classified extraction missions under direct command authority. She opened the folder. My father was saved by that woman. Not once. Not by luck. By direct medical intervention she performed without waiting for permission, because permission would have meant his death. She looked at each board member individually. I've been in the Coast Guard for 19 years. I've served with people who display the kind of character your hospital fired. They're called heroes. You called her insubordinate. The silence in that room became physical, like pressure against the eardrums. Nobody moved. The board chair cleared his throat. Captain Mitchell, we were not aware of, no, she interrupted. You weren't. Because you didn't ask. You accepted the word of a man who was threatened by competence and mistook it for insubordination. She gathered the folder. The Coast Guard is formally requesting reinstatement and restitution. The White House has taken an interest in this case. Then she walked out, leaving the room in a silence so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Danielle sat in the visitors' gallery when the declassified file was finally unsealed and placed in her trembling hands by a Coast Guard liaison officer named Commander Patricia Halloway. The folder was marked with a red security stripe. Inside were photographs from operations she hadn't discussed in years, mission reports with her name embedded in operational details, extraction summaries that read like fiction but carried the weight of classified truth. 17 assets extracted from a collapsing safe house. 3 operations conducted under cover of darkness. Names of coalition partners, dates, locations, and her role in each one, documented in the precise language of military record-keeping. One page showed a photograph of her in Baghdad, younger, harder, standing in front of a destroyed structure with 3 soldiers whose faces had been redacted but whose posture suggested they were deferring to her authority. The caption read, Senior Chief Ross, Operation Falcon's Eye, the 15th of June, 2008. She'd never shown anyone these records. She'd been ordered to disappear, ordered to forget, ordered to never speak of what happened in that compound. The Coast Guard had buried the file so deep that even her husband had never known the full scope of what she'd done. Her hands shook as she read through the documentation of her own life, the one she'd hidden so carefully that she'd almost convinced herself it was fiction. But there it was, sealed and stamped and official, proof that everything she'd been, everything she'd survived, actually mattered. The tears came then, not in public shame but in something else entirely, recognition. She was seeing herself in print for the first time in 15 years. The SEAL team leader who'd coordinated the Baghdad operation stood in front of news cameras outside the federal courthouse in downtown Savannah, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to say. His name was redacted in official capacity, but his medal ribbon rank was unmistakable. Bronze Star with Valor, he said, holding up a single official document. The cameras flashed. Purple Heart. Another page. The journalists leaned forward. Joint Service Achievement Medal. He paused, letting the weight settle. 2 Purple Hearts. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. And a Navy Cross. The last document was held aloft long enough for photographs, and the journalist gasped. A Navy Cross. The 3rd highest military decoration for Valor. This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. She saved 14 lives in a single night while taking shrapnel wounds to the abdomen and left shoulder. Your hospital fired her for saving one more. He folded the document slowly and deliberately. You picked a fight with someone you had no idea was standing across from you. The cameras exploded with questions that he didn't answer. He simply walked back into the courthouse, his message delivered with surgical precision. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. Not even close. The real devastation came from within his own fortress. James Torres, the IT director at Oak Creek Memorial and a former Marine Corps combat engineer, was conducting a routine investigation into the security systems when he noticed something in the access logs that made his blood cold. Dr. Sterling had accessed the security footage system multiple times in the past 72 hours, unusual for a physician, impossible to explain as routine hospital business. Torres pulled the complete access records and found the evidence of Sterling's desperation. Sterling had attempted to delete recordings from the weeks leading up to Danielle's termination. Multiple attempts. Failed deletion commands. Attempts to overwrite the data. But Torres had designed the system with redundancy specifically because he'd worked with military networks that understood that documentation was survival. Every frame had been automatically preserved in separate backup systems. Every timestamp was tamper-evident. Every deletion attempt was itself recorded and logged. Torres compiled the evidence methodically, the deletion attempts, the restored footage showing Sterling's campaign of harassment in brutal clarity, the documented timeline of his calculated retaliation. The footage was devastating, Sterling's public mockery in front of patients' families, his deliberate undermining of Danielle in front of her colleagues, his orchestrated humiliations recorded from 6 different angles. One clip showed him loudly questioning her competence in front of the commander's wife. Another showed him in the break room, laughing about that nurse thinking she's a doctor. Another showed him specifically instructing staff to exclude her from shifts. Every moment of his calculated cruelty was preserved in crystal clarity. Torres walked the evidence directly to the state medical board investigator and copied the hospital's legal counsel, and when he handed over the external drive, he said quietly, "This is a Marine turning in evidence of another service member's misconduct. Every frame is backed up, time-stamped, and tamper-evident." He tried to destroy evidence of his own conduct. That's not just professional misconduct. That's obstruction. The investigator's face went very still. The State Medical Board's emergency session lasted exactly 4 hours. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just the harassment, which was bad enough, but the deliberate destruction of evidence, which transformed the case from professional misconduct to criminal liability. Sterling's attorney argued about the security footage's admissibility and context and chain of custody, but the backups were airtight. The redacted recordings of his harassment were undeniable. The medical documentation of his interference with Danielle's patient care was in the official record. By the time the votes were counted, Sterling's medical license wasn't just suspended. It was revoked. Permanently. Within a month, the legal notification was printed on official state medical board letterhead. Dr. Marcus Sterling's medical license is permanently revoked due to demonstrated pattern of harassment, evidence tampering, and professional misconduct. 6 months later, Danielle stood in the Rose Garden at the White House in a navy blue suit that had been tailored specifically for this moment. The Presidential Citizen's Medal, the highest civilian honor, placed around her neck by the president himself, caught the sunlight as photographers captured the image that would be remembered for decades. The citation read her full military record, the operations in Baghdad, the lives saved in contested zones, the classified missions that had been specifically declassified for this public recognition. Commander Mitchell stood in the front row with his wife and his daughter in her dress uniform, fully recovered from cardiac tamponade. Patricia Chen attended in her dress uniform, representing the Coast Guard Nurses Association. Master Chief Henson stood with a delegation of former operators who'd worked with Danielle in Baghdad. Rashid Al-Hamzi, now a permanent resident working as a translator for refugee services, wept openly as the medal was placed. The president's remarks included words that would be quoted in news cycles for years. True class is what you do when the lights go out, when no one is watching, when there's no reward but the knowledge that you did what was right. The Rose Garden erupted in applause. The Coast Guard formally reinstated her records and offered her a position as senior medical instructor for all Coast Guard search and rescue operations. Oak Creek Memorial's board issued a public apology and invited her to return as Director of Emergency Services. She declined both with quiet grace, accepting instead a position at the VA hospital in Charleston where she could serve veterans who understood what it meant to carry invisible scars. It was work that mattered. Work that nobody would medal for, but work that would save lives one conversation at a time. As for Dr. Marcus Sterling, a former colleague spotted him 6 months later sitting at a folding table in a strip mall in South Savannah with a hand-painted banner reading supplemental insurance plans. His white coat had been replaced by a polo shirt with a company logo. His stethoscope had been exchanged for plastic business cards that nobody asked for. His authority had evaporated like morning fog. The woman who saw him, a radiologist who'd respected him once, didn't acknowledge him as she walked past. He watched her go with eyes that had learned shame. Danielle never spoke about him publicly. She didn't need to. His actions had spoken for themselves in ways that words never could. In her new office at the VA hospital, she had the faded unit patch framed on the wall next to her bronze star, her purple heart, and the photograph of Marcus. Each morning she pressed her palm against the glass frame, and instead of the grief that had lived there for 3 years, she felt something entirely new: pride. Pride in who she was. Pride in what she'd endured. Pride in the person she'd become. When young veterans came to her office asking for advice, struggling with the invisible weight of service, she told them what she'd learned in the hardest way possible: stay true to who you are. The right people will see it eventually, and the wrong people will destroy themselves trying to dim your light. If you've made it this far, you know what real courage looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. But when it finally stands up, the whole world watches. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength revealing itself. Like this video and comment, what would you have done in Danielle's position?